according to the Victorians, social class was not only and not most importantly about the money. It was more about certain traditions, modes of behavior, lifestyle, the choices of daily things like the food you ate, the clothes you wore, the kind of leisure activities that you engaged in, even the kind of railway ticket you would buy. So there is a very interesting example that Sally Mitchell makes, that if a working man won a lot of money, let's say at the horse races, he would never buy a first-class ticket to return to the city. Because this was not done, because he was from the working class and he would ride in a lower class train car than the aristocracy and the gentry who would normally ride in the first class car. So the manners, the language they used, the education, the values could be different, and this was more important than only the money. However, in the 19th century, there appears a belief that wasn't there before, that through hard work and self-help, to use a very Victorian word that is self-education, you and your family could advance on a social scale. So from the time of the French Revolution onwards, there is a growing belief that you are not destined to die in the same social class you were born into. If you succeed in life and can overcome the limitations of your upbringing, of your childhood, you can advance, and if not yourself, then your children might be accepted to a higher stratum of the society. This is very important because class belonging was probably the most important thing for the Victorians, right after gender belonging, let's say. So after it was clear whether you were a man or a woman, and we'll talk about it when we talk about Victorian values, the next most important thing was which class you belonged to. So even if the situation was relatively fresh and fluid, so there were no legal restrictions like who belonged to, let's say, the skilled working class and who could belong to the lower middle class, or who belonged to the upper middle class and who could count themselves among the gentry. There were no legal rules, but people were making unofficial rules, like they were looking for ways to distinguish between those stratified areas of society so that everybody would know where they stood, where their family stood, and the acquaintances they knew where they were on the social ladder. So what we have, especially in the context of the middle class, is the growing popularity of status symbols. So specific behaviors that are introduced to announce that you and your family belonged to middle class, and to which particular section of the middle class as well. So it's not trivial. This is something that was extremely important for the Victorians. The distinction between the middle class and the upper class was perhaps easier than the distinction between the working class and the middle class, because there was a very clear difference in the way that these two classes worked. To make it short, the upper class, the aristocracy and landed gentry did not work at all. They did not have to work. They inherited the money, they inherited the land, and they got their income from the rental of their property. So they would have tenants, the tenants would pay rent, and this is how the landowners would earn their living. Sometimes they might have huge estates, sometimes counting thousands of acres, and then they would have a lot of money from rent. Sometimes smaller estates, but still they were able to not to be forced to work professionally. Some of them chose to work. It was quite often for younger sons of the aristocracy to have some sort of profession, especially as military officers in the army, in the navy. Sometimes these things run in the family, so there were like the perks of being aristocrats, that you might get prestigious, well-paid positions. Some of them worked as colonial administrators, especially in the second half of the 19th century. Also, the higher positions in the Church of England very often went to the sons of the upper class. You have to remember that Church of England allowed and even encouraged the marriage of the clergy. So these things could actually run in the family. There was no vow of celibacy, and the Anglican clergy married, had children. It was all perfectly respectable. So that's the upper class, to make it very, very quick. And if you compare it with the upper middle class, the main difference would be that if you belong to the middle class, you would have to work for money. You would have to work for your upkeep. You might have prestigious, well-paid professional jobs, and this is something that the upper middle class would very often aspire to. So all kinds of professions like in the medicine, in the law, university professors, also in the military, perhaps not the top positions, but still officers' positions could go to the let's say upper middle class people. Also, all kinds of administrative jobs, and there are more and more such jobs appearing on the let's say work market in the 19th century. We'll talk about it at a later stage when we talk about work in Victorian times. But the important thing is that the middle class had to work. Sometimes, and this was a very important status symbol for upper middle class, and a kind of aspirational model for middle class, sometimes the income of the man of the family, the father and husband of the family, was enough so that the wife didn't have to work. So having a non-working wife became a very important status symbol for rich Victorians. It doesn't mean that the family could not work, could be spared the necessity to work. They had to work even if it was just the master of the house. If we look at the middle class, so we have those three sections, and They are of course divided by income, but also by the changes in the lifestyle and the ways in which the income was spent. So beside having a non-working wife, it was a very important status symbol for the upper middle class, for example, to have their own means of transport. Before the very, very end of the 19th century and the Edwardian period, it meant a horse-drawn carriage. So this was a very expensive thing, which required additional place to garage the carriage and also to keep the horses, plus additional staff to tend the horses. But it was a very important status symbol because this meant that the family was not dependent on public transport. If they traveled for far distances, they could use the train, of course, the first class, and if there were 3 classes, we'll talk about the railways later on, but initially there were 3 classes, so they more or less corresponded to the 3 classes in the society. Later there were 2 classes, so really depending on their income, they might want to travel first class if they were really rich and they could afford it. So having your own means of transport was important. Also, all kinds of lifestyle choices, like where you would live. Most lodgings were rented. It wasn't very common to own a house. If you could do it, it was good, but it was not really expected of the middle class to own the places they lived in. Rent wasn't as expensive as at some later dates, including today, so it wasn't like the biggest expenditure in the family budget, but choosing the right district, the right area, the right kind of house was an important choice. Also the leisure activities that were available within the budget of the middle class family could distinguish between let's say various strata of the middle class. So which theater would you go to, and if you could afford to go to the theater, what kind of ticket would you buy? If you went, for example, to the opera, would you have a box, so like a special place? Only the richest members of the society could do this. So what kind of socializing you would engage in? Could you have fashionable dinner parties? And if so, how would the food be served? Would all the dishes be served at once and the guests would just help themselves, or you would have domestic servants serving each dish individually? So this was all about ostensibly everyday simple choices, but it meant like positioning the family on the social ladder. What kind of clothes you wore? Could you afford to follow the latest fashions? How many changes of clothing you would have? What kind of education would you pay for your children? Would you send them to a private school, or perhaps you would employ a private governess or a tutor to teach them at home? Where would you go for holidays? Would you go to the seaside? If yes, then to which town? Or would you go abroad? If yes, then exactly where? So all these little things were extremely important, and they would allow the people, especially the people belonging to the middle class, to position themselves and their family in the society. And it was much more important than, let's say, in the 20th century or now. This was like the most important information about the family. And of course, everybody was very ambitious, and they tried to maintain social contacts with people slightly above them on the social scale, perhaps to encourage the relationships and later marriages between the children from a similar social background, or perhaps slightly higher up. This was a kind of dream that many Victorians had of social advancement. And for the first time in history, this was not only the thing of literature. This was not only a dream that you might read about and not aspire to. Of course, one of the most important things, and this is the thing that really distinguishes between the skilled working class and the lower middle class, was to be able to employ a domestic servant. Domestic service was an absolute necessity for the middle class and the upper class. And of course, the number of servants you could employ depended greatly on your family income. But you could not count your family among even the lower middle class if you could employ no servants. Most servants lived with the family. We will talk about the different kinds of servants, and especially the household that employed lots of servants, like aristocratic homes, because this would be like a hierarchy of employment, and sometimes not all the servants would even meet the members of the family. But within the middle class, it would mean, of course, smaller houses to keep, and there would be less servants, sometimes doing more work or less specialized work than in larger households. But still, if you could afford just one servant, this would normally be a young teenage girl in training for better positions. She would normally be called a maid of all work, so a kind of general servant without any specified duties, like being a cook or being a housemaid or being a nursery maid. So being occupied mostly in the kitchen or cleaning the house or minding the family children. She would be a general servant, and nobody really expected this single servant household to be running smoothly without any physical help from the lady of the house. There was so much to be done, and we'll talk about daily life a lot, but just to indicate, everything had to be done from scratch. There was no pre-prepared food, so all the cooking was done from scratch. There was no refrigeration, so if you wanted to keep the food longer, you had to preserve it in pots or other ways. You had to do it yourself. The cleaning was a hard daily chore. You have to remember that they didn't have electricity in private homes throughout the 19th century, basically. So everything was heated by fireplaces, mostly coal fireplaces. Cooking was also done on a coal-powered range. The lighting was either gas or kerosene lamps or candles. But especially those coal fires produced a lot of dust. So in one of the books I read information that the amount of daily cleaning in a Victorian home was equivalent to this kind of great spring cleaning that we only do a few times a year. And having a clean house, generally cleanliness, was a very important status symbol for the Victorians. So if you wanted to have a clean house, if you wanted to have clean clothes, and you had to wash them basically from scratch, they didn't even have the washing powder yet, or hot water, you have to boil the water. So you had to really use a little or more of the elbow grease, as the Victorians said, so hard physical work. And if you read this chapter from Sally Mitchell's book, you will find that only when the family could employ more or less 3 servants, 3 or 4 servants, it really depends on the size of the family and on the number of children. If they didn't have children, or they have just 1 or 2 children, you might be able to just do managerial work as the lady of the house if you had 3 servants. If you had more children, and the average number of children for the Victorian family around the mid-Victorian period, so the middle of the century, was 5.5. So 5 or 6 children per family. This was average. It means there were many families that had more children than that. Then you would need at least 4 servants for the lady of the house to be spared physical housework and just managing, deciding what to buy and what to cook for dinner, rather than helping with the physical process of cooking, cleaning, laundry, and all that. So if you had those 3 or 4 servants, you could count yourself among the middle class, more or less. Let's say this was one of the important things. Before, you were lower middle class at best. So you had 1 or 2 servants, but very often the wife had to work as well, especially if the family worked at some sort of shop, or they could share some of the work. This was quite common for the lower middle class to do, but still the wife would have to participate in housework, and they could not dream of, more expensive holidays and more expensive schools or private education for children, more expensive leisure activities, or even the most fashionable foods or clothes, but they could be counted among the middle class. So that's the situation with the classes, and we continue in a moment.